Um, I've been given, Mike said, okay, you've got about over an hour of material, an hour of teaching to give, broken into two sections. So here's your passage, Proverbs 19, verse 20. It gave me a one-line proverb, said, fill up an hour with that, if you will, please. So since I'm the first one up, and the other speakers will be talking about Proverbs, I'd like to start by providing some background information, not only on the book of Proverbs itself, but also some background as far as Hebrew poetry is concerned. So this is a kind of an introduction class for all the speakers, and all the other speakers have been told, Mike is taking care of the intro material on Sunday night so that they can just speed ahead with other material when it's their turn. So let's talk about the Old Testament, books and types. The book of Proverbs is one of 39 books of the Old Testament. These 39 books were not only written by different people over a span of about 1,100 years, but they also had different literary styles. They had, of course, different content. And, of course, they had different purposes. For example, there we go. For example, the Pentateuch, or the Law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5 books. What do we get out of those 5 books? Well, these provided the creation narrative, the basics for ethics, for social morality, for Jewish liturgy, and also the basis for our monotheistic worldview. Where do we go to get that source information? Well, we go to the first 5 books of the Bible. It's also from Genesis that we learn that there is only one God, and He is the creator of the world. Matthew doesn't talk about that. John doesn't talk about that. Paul really doesn't address the issue, who created the world. Where do we go to get that information? Well, we go to the Pentateuch. We go to the early books of the Bible. Also, it's from Genesis that we learn how man and the creation came to be, what and how it is today. How did man arrive at this situation? Well, Genesis will tell you about that. And it's from the Pentateuch, those first 5 books, that we learn about God's initial plan to save mankind and the creation. And we also learn about the role of the Jewish nation in that plan. So where do we learn? How did God decide to come to this earth? What was He going to be? He was going to take on human form. So what human form was that going to be? Was He going to be Polish? Was He going to be Italian? Was He going to, what? Well, in the first 5 books of the Bible, we find out that He wasn't going to be any of the existing cultures. We find out that He picked one man, and from that one man, He created an entire nation, but not just an entire nation. He gave that nation a culture and a religion and a history and a sense of ethics and laws and social customs and liturgy, how to worship. In other words, He created an entire cultural reference, if you wish, an entire cultural stage upon which the Son of God would enter. So where do we find that? Where do we get that story? Well, we get it from the Pentateuch. Then we have the books of history, 12 books, Joshua all the way to Esther. They provide the history of the Jewish people, their leaders, their organization, their battles, dealings with God and other nations. We find out about that in the books of history. Then there are the books of prophecy, 17 in all, from Isaiah all the way to Malachi. And these here, very interesting, they contain more intimate details of God's relationship with the nation, and especially with the leaders of the nation. When I say the leaders of the nation, I don't mean all the nations, I mean the nation of Israel. Because the Bible is basically tracing, a line, a golden line of history that follows the Jewish people. Yes, there's reference from time to time to other nations here and there, that the Jews come in contact with, and you get a sense of the world history. But really, the Bible is following one thread, and that's the Jewish people, and how through them the Son of God would come. And so the history, when you hear, that is a history book in the Bible, in the Old Testament. It's a history book of the Jews. Okay? And so it was from these books that the coming of the Messiah in the future was described in detail. They also contain history in the form of prophecy, a kind of forward history, where God, through the prophets, would reveal future events in the lives of the Jewish nation and the world. And then you have the books of poetry, 5 books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. So all those equal the 39 books. These contained elements of prayer and worship and devotion to God. They helped us understand the Jewish mindset. They also help us to understand our concept of God, because there were many wild, pagan concepts of God. And so in the books of poetry, we get a very personal look into the mind of God. They also helped understand the Jewish mindset and how the Jew related to God. Now, the poetic form helped describe the character of God the Father and his relationship with man in all kinds of situations, especially in the books of poetry. For example, as an individual being, in other words, the relationship with God as an individual being. I mean, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. That's a very personal, thing to say, a very intimate. He says, notice it, he doesn't say, the Lord is our shepherd. He says, the Lord is my shepherd. He does this for me. He sets a table before me. It's me and God in Psalm 23. We find through the books of poetry a description of man's relationship with God from an emotional and as a sexual being. The book of Job is filled with raw emotion. The emotion of a man who believes God and believes that what has happened to him because of God somehow. And then, of course, in the Song of Solomon, a book that talks about in poetic form the intimacy that exists between a man and a woman. Poetic form allows this type of description. And then, of course, man as a social being, the Psalms and the Proverbs, how one ought to act, and so on and so forth, which is where we're going tonight. So the 39 books of the Old Testament each had a style, a purpose, and a point of view that helped the reader know the mind of God, know the will of God, and the way that God dealt with people in a variety of situations. I don't read, when I need comfort, as a man and as a fallible man, as a sinful man, when I'm needing the comfort of the Scriptures, I don't usually go to the book of Revelation. You know what I'm saying? I don't go there. I go to the Psalms, where a fallible man is pouring his heart out to God, is sometimes mad at God and sometimes mad at his enemies, cries out about the unfairness of life, much like I cry out from time to time, and you cry out to God. I know you love me, God, but why does this hurt so much? I know you love me, Lord, but why did you take the one that I love? I don't find that intimate, personal, feeling relationship. The book of Romans was not written for that. But the book of Psalms was written for that. And the book of Job was written for that. All right, so that's a breakdown of the Old Testament books. Now, we're going to focus on Hebrew poetry because the book of Proverbs falls into that particular classification. I said that much of the Old Testament is written in poetic form, but not just one type of poetic form. Just as Western poetry, I don't mean Western like cowboy poetry, I mean Western civilization, okay? Just as Western poetry has different formats, for example, there is a lyric poem or a sonnet or a dramatic monologue or a ballad, different styles of poetry. Hebrew poetry also had different formats. For example, there is, hang on a second here, it didn't work. There we go. Whoops, go back, there we go. There is gnomic poetry, you don't pronounce the G, meaning poetry that teaches wisdom and reflection on life. Proverbs, for example, is an example of gnomic poetry. The book of Job as well. There's also lyric poetry. Remember, we're talking about the styles of poetry that we find in Hebrew poetry. So lyric poetry, praise, lamentation, confession. The book of Psalms, for example, the book of Lamentation, lyric poetry. Then there are tribal songs. Tribal songs, usually the commemoration of some event. In Genesis 4:23, you have an example of a tribal song. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. That's a boast. That's a yeah, we did it, we won. We will rock you. This is we will rock you back in the day, way back in the day. Tribal songs, you're laughing, but that we will rock, that's a tribal song. Sports is all about tribalism. Don't get me going there, okay? We won't do that. All right? Then you have another type called blessings and cursings. For example, in Genesis 9, 25 and 26, you have the blessing and cursing by Noah. Cursed be Canaan, he says, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers. And he also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. There's an example of blessing and cursing, a type of poetic expression. In Genesis 24, another example of this, when Rebekah's family blessed her, they said, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. Blessings, cursings, a style of Hebrew poetry. Another style, the mashal, lessons and riddles. Judges 14, Samson's riddle about the honey. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And then it says, but they could not tell the riddle, a mashal, wisdom. And then you have paeans. Paeans are songs of victory. In Exodus, for example, chapter 15, verses 1 to 18, after they crossed the Red Sea, Moses, sings, a song of victory, a paean, another form of poetry. And then dirges. Dirges were funeral songs. One famous one is David's Lament, and it's in 2 Samuel, chapter 1, 17 to 20. It says, then this is after Jonathan and Saul had been killed in battle. And David, it says, David chanted with this lament over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jeshar, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How have the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, the daughters of the uncircumcised will exult, and it goes on and on. Okay? A dirge. So the Old Testament, as I said, has 39 books. each with a different purpose, and each containing various forms of poetry. Many of them, the forms are mixed all in the same book. Now, we have to interpret the poetry. If you've ever taken an English lit class and you've suffered through that, reading poems and trying to figure out what the guy is saying, well, the same thing happens in Hebrew poetry. It helps if you understand the things, the techniques that they used, the devices that they used in their poetry. Because Hebrew poetry is different than modern or Western poetry in that it has a different rhythm. And it does not use, it's usually by accident if it does not use rhyme. So, in the West, we have things, the cat and the bat in the hat had a spat. We have rhythm in our poetry. We use rhyme in various schemes, not always, but many times. Hebrew poetry does not have the same beat as much of traditional Western poetry. Instead, Hebrew poetry stresses different words in each verse. I'll give you an example in Psalm 54, verses 1 and 2. So let's just read the psalm as if I was reading it, okay? Just reading it out of my book in English. It would be, "Save me, O God, by thy name, and vindicate me by thy might. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth." That's reading it in English. But in the Hebrew, certain words are emphasized. This is how they gave texture and depth to their poetry. So they would read it, "Save me, O God, by thy name, and vindicate me by thy might. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth." Accents, accents, okay? So this is a common 3-2 rhythm, 3 beats in one verse, 2 beats in the next, 3 beats in one, 2 beats in the next. Hebrew rhythm for their poetry had various combinations of these beats. So the 3-2, which is called the lament beat, if you wish, or rhythm rather. But it was sometimes 2 beats and 2 beats, and 2 beats and 2 beats. Sometimes 3 and 3. Sometimes 3-2-2, 3-2-2. Sometimes 2-2-2, 2. This is how, again, they gave flavor to the poetry that they were doing. So the first feature of Hebrew poetry is its rhythm, accenting different words in each line using either the 3-2, 2-2, 3-3, whatever rhythms. Another thing that's very important, and if you were in Mike Cogshill class, probably talked about this, and that was the idea of parallelism. One of the more significant discoveries that helped scholars interpret Hebrew poetry was made in the 1700s by Bishop Robert Lowth. He was a bishop of the Church of England, and also he was a professor of poetry at Oxford University. So he understood ancient poetry. This is what gave him insight into this idea. He developed the idea that even though Hebrew poetry did not have rhyme of words like English or Western poetry, it had a rhyme of thought. In other words, in Hebrew poetry, it was the ideas that played off of each other and not the words. Okay? So Lowth, he didn't invent this feature. He simply rediscovered a trait of Hebrew poetry that had been ignored and lost since the 2nd century AD. This discovery was very helpful in determining the meaning of much of the material in the Old Testament that was in poetic form. He called this rhyme of thought, he's the one that coined the term parallelism. And he described 3 basic forms of parallelism found in Hebrew poetry, but not exclusive to Hebrew poetry. It's not as if the Jews invented this. They used this thing, this system, they used this approach, but we're not the only ones who used it. Now there are 6 main types of parallelism. Here's the first 3. The first one is synonymous parallelism. Synonymous parallelism is when the author says the same thing twice using different words. For example, in Psalm 19, 1 to 4, it says, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." Let me go to 4 here. "There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through the earth, and their utterances to the end of the world. In them he has placed a tent for the sun." And he continues. There's synonymous parallelism. He says the same thing in the second verse that he says in the first verse, but he uses different words. For example, he says, "There's no speech, nor are there words." And then he says, "Their voice is not heard." He's saying the very same thing, but using different words. "Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their utterances to the end of the world." Saying the same thing, except using different words. Let me go back to the first two. "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and the expanse," that's the heavens, "is declaring the work of his hands." The glory of God, the work of his hand, same thing. Parallelism. Okay? Synonymous, the same. Parallelism. Let me just give you, I think I had another one here too I wanted to show you. Psalm 24, 1 to 3. "The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it." Well, then the earth is the Lord and everything it contains, and then he says, the world and those who are in it. Hasn't he said the same thing twice? Then he says, "For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." Same thing. "Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? And who may stand in his holy place?" The hill of the Lord, the holy place, same thing. Parallelism. Okay? Synonymous. All right, let's move on. Another kind, antithetic parallelism. This is where the second line completes the thought in the first line. Let's take a look at a sample of this. Psalm 2, verse 6. "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." So he knows the way of the righteous, that's one way. The way of the wicked, they'll perish. Saying something different in the second line. Let's go to Psalm 30, verse 5. For his anger is but for a moment, but his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. The opposite. Sadness and joy. Tears and happiness. Antithetic parallelism. Another type, synthetic parallelism. Here the second line completes the thought in the first line. So Psalm 2, verse 6, "But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." Second line adds more information to the first line. Let's try another one. Psalm 3, verse 4. "I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain." Well, they're not opposite, these things. They're not the same, they're not opposite. The first line says, "I'm crying to the Lord with my voice," and the second line, gives more information. "And he answered me from his holy mountain." Synthetic parallelism. So those were the first three that Loth kind of developed and kind of brought forward the idea of synonymous, antithetic, and synthetic. But others have been discovered or developed since that time. Another type is the introverted parallelism. That's where the first line and the last line are the same, and the two middle lines are the same. So A and, line 1 is like line 4, and line 2 is like line 3. Okay? So let's take a look, see if I can find one. Psalm 23. "My son," not Psalm 23, but Proverb 23. "My son, if your heart is wise," next line, "my own heart will also be glad, and my inmost being will rejoice." You see, line 2 and 3 are the same. He says, "My own heart will be glad," okay? And then he says, "and my inmost being," what's that? Well, that's his heart. Will be glad? No, will rejoice. So 2 and 3 are the same. And then when you read the fourth line, when your lips speak what is right. Well, what was the first line? The first line, my son, if your heart is wise. Fourth line, when your lips speak what is right. First line, fourth line, the same. Second line, third line, the same. Introverted parallelism. Okay? Another one, climactic parallelism. They used to call this stair-like because it builds. It just doesn't build for one line, but it builds for several lines. So let's take an example of climactic parallelism. Psalm 29, verses 1 and 2. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Worship the Lord in holy array. He builds, he builds, he builds. Okay? Stair-like, climactic, always building to a greater climax, line by line by line. And then the sixth type is emblematic parallelism. In other words, makes a comparison, usually uses the word like or as. Psalm 42, verse 1. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, like and as. Okay? A comparison, like or as, emblematic. So, understanding how Hebrew poetry is put together helps the reader determine the meaning of the verses that they are studying. So let me give you an example of that. In Psalm 103, verse 3, it's talking about God, and it says, who pardons all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases. So we know from the little bit we've talked about tonight, this is an example of synonymous parallelism. In other words, the same thing is being said 2 times. So if you were to ask the question, is the author actually saying that God heals all believers of all diseases? Because somebody could just pick, you pick and choose. Somebody could pick that second line there, and it says, God heals all your diseases. So if you're a Christian, God heals all your diseases, and you could run with that if you wanted to. Is that what he's saying? Well, no. The author repeats the idea that God can forgive all sins. And then he calls these things iniquities in one line and refers to them as diseases in the second line. So what he's saying here is that God forgives and is able to forgive all your iniquities, and then he simply repeats that idea in the second line, who heals all your diseases. Same idea, repeated twice using different words. Another example, Psalm 16, this is the only one I'll give you. Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely. Well, what does my glory rejoices mean? What does that mean? I understand the individual words, but what does that mean? My glory rejoices. Again, synonymous parallelism. Heart and glory are the same. He says the same thing twice. My heart is glad and my glory rejoices. Same thing. My flesh will also dwell securely. So that was a kind of a breakthrough for those who studied Hebrew poetry. Now, we said that rhythm is one device that the Jews used. Parallelism, that was another device that they used in their poetry. But those weren't the only devices that they used. It's hot in here, isn't it, all of a sudden? Can somebody get up and turn on the AC for us, please? Is that it? Thank you, guy. Yeah, there you go. So as I say, Hebrew poetry used devices such as rhythm and parallelism to emphasize certain words and play ideas off of each other. There were other devices used in order to make this poetry unique and artful. So some of the other devices. A thing called assonance. In English, two, and two. Using words that sound the same but mean different things. They would use those in certain poetry. The strategic placement of similar sounding words that meant different things and put them all in the same line. In English, we call these things homonyms, right? Two, two, and two. T-O meaning I'm going to the store. T-O-O means too much. I have too much money. And then T-W-O, I have two sisters, you know. And to this day, I get mail and I get texts and I get stuff where people still haven't figured out two, two, and two. And I don't correct them. I just let it go. All right, and then another device. So you've got this assonance, you know, the use of similar sounding words and so on and so forth. Another device really is used very, very well is an acrostic. An acrostic is where each verse of a psalm or a poem begins with a succeeding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. English alphabet 26, Hebrew alphabet 22 letters. For example, Psalm 25 has 22 verses, and each verse begins with the succeeding letters of the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet. That's called an acrostic, and there are many acrostics in the Old Testament. A very fascinating one is Psalm 119. So fascinating. Psalm 119 is the longest psalm, the longest chapter, and also the longest chapter in the Bible. It has 176 verses. That's just for one psalm. What's interesting is that those 126 verses are divided into 22 stanzas. You know, you might call them paragraphs if you wish, but in a poem you call them stanzas. 176 verses divided into 22 stanzas. One stanza for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And in each stanza, there are 8 verses, and each verse begins with the very same letter. So let me explain to you, if this was in English, what this would look like. If it were in English, it would mean that there would be 26 stanzas, right, because we have 26 letters, one for each letter of the English alphabet. And then, in the first stanza, representing the letter A, every one of the 8 verses in that stanza would begin with the letter A. And then in the second stanza, 8 verses, every single verse in that stanza would begin with the letter B. And then the third stanza, 8 verses, every single verse in that stanza would begin with the letter C, and just keep going all the way down to the letter Z. Again, don't worry about the bells. You know, we're self-contained here. The kids are going to go their own way, and we'll break when I feel like it. Actually, you know, no. I just had a little a little rush there. Just sorry. I've always wanted to say that from the pulpit, you know, but. So that's Psalm 119. Another interesting thing about Psalm 119 is that in almost every one of the 176 verses, there is a synonym, meaning, you know, a word that means the same. There is a synonym for the word Torah, which means the law. For example, in verse 1, it talks about, you know, God, about those who walk in the law of the Lord. Verse 2, who observe his testimonies. Verse 3, they walk in his ways. The word law, the word testimonies, the word ways are referring to the same thing. They're synonyms. Well, you've got 176 verses, and in most of those verses, you've got a word that is a synonym for the law of Moses. So the poetry contained in the Old Testament, and especially in the book that we're going to study this VBS time here, which is Proverbs, used a variety of devices to accentuate, compare, beautify, and help readers to memorize the words of God's inspired writers. Understanding these devices and how they were used helps us today better appreciate and understand these ancient texts. Okay, we're going to move on, do one more thing, and then we'll take a little break, all right? So this brings us to the book and the verse that is the subject of tonight's VBS theme and this adult class, and that is, have ears to hear and do God's word. Before we go on to that specific verse, let's do a brief introduction of the book of Proverbs, since all the speakers after me will be teaching from the book of Proverbs. So we start big, the big picture, right? 39 books of the Old Testament, and we squeeze it down to the Hebrew poetry, and now we're going to squeeze it down to the particular book of Hebrew poetry that we're going to look at, and then we're going to squeeze it down to the particular verse that we have been assigned. So let's go through this. Introduction to Proverbs. Well, the Hebrew name is Proverbs of Solomon. The Hebrew word mashal is frequently translated into the English word proverb. A mashal means a representation or a similitude. Mashals or proverbs are mostly observations relative to life and character, commonly expressed in short, pithy sayings. You'll notice in the Proverbs you don't have one big, long 40 verse, on one topic. It's usually one or two verses. The author, although the title of the book credits Solomon as the author, there are references in the book itself that name other contributors to the book, although Solomon is credited with the majority of the book's content. But in chapter 25, there's a reference, in Proverbs 25, there's a reference to the men of Hezekiah who transcribed Solomon's sayings. And then in chapter 30, Agur, the son of Jacob. And then in chapter 31, the words of King Lemuel, about the worthy wife. So you've got different people there mentioned as contributors. According to 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32, Solomon wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. And in the book of Proverbs, we only have about 800 of Solomon's proverbs that are recorded. So that means there are more that were not recorded than are actually recorded. When we say he was the wisest man and so on and so forth, we get a little glimpse of that. When you read Proverbs, you go, wow, this person, amazing. And yet we only have 800 of the 3,000 that he wrote, not counting the 1,005 songs or psalms. There are some of those recorded, but not many. Agur and Lemuel are only mentioned here in this book, nowhere else, and we don't have any other information about them. The purpose of the book, this is important to understand because it really speaks to the verse that we're going to look at. The book of Proverbs is designed to prevent an ungodly lifestyle or to remedy an ungodly lifestyle and promote a lifestyle whose basis is the fear or wisdom of the Lord. Very important to understand that the key word in the book is wisdom, meaning the ability to live skillfully. Because wisdom equals skill, the ability that you have and use. In other words, an individual who skillfully uses knowledge to live right before God. You ever say to somebody, your ex-brother-in-law or your crazy cousin or uncle, and you say, well, he's a mess. And you're not saying it lovingly. Some people say it lovingly because they're busy. Oh, you're a mess, But sometimes you're just being kind by saying, oh, he's a mess, meaning his life is a mess. Or you say things like, well, he's his own worst enemy. Or like if he's got two things to choose from, he'll always choose the thing that'll blow up in his face, Well, the book of Proverbs is aimed at people so that they won't make a mess of their lives, that they'll be able to live skillfully, that they'll be able to use the wisdom of God in a skillful way to kind of, work their way through life and be able to live before God in a righteous way. And then there's this word instruction. You could kind of use the word discipline, same thing. How do you develop this skill? You develop it through discipline, through instruction. So Proverbs provides detailed instructions for God's people to deal successfully with the practical affairs of everyday life. How to deal skillfully in our relationships with God, with family, with society, even with government. Now, the themes. 3 themes. Proverbs is a manual of conduct, if you wish. It's a teaching guide. Its ideas have 3 main themes. First, the ethical theme, doing right, speaking and seeking to do what is true. The general motive to live ethically is very practical. There's no highfalutin ideas here. You know, Solomon says you need to live practically and skillfully if you don't want to die young. That's his point. The wise manage to live a little longer than the foolish ones. The foolish ones, you know, they fall into traps and so on and so forth. So the point made over and over again is that the skillful or the wise have good long lives, and the fools, well, they just die young. Second theme is a religious theme. God is supreme. God is absolute in power. There is no mention of other supernatural beings like angels or anything like that. Makes no references to idolatry. There's no messianic allusions. Doesn't talk about the coming of the Messiah. There's no reference to the temple, the priests, worship. You know, there's none of that in Proverbs. In Proverbs, obedience to God is the ultimate skill to cultivate. If you can do that, he says, you're on your way. If you learn how to obey God. And I might make just a little parenthetical statement. What's this VBS all about? It's all about teaching children from an early age to obey God. I mean, that's really what it is. We're trying to teach them how to obey God. Unfortunately, in our society, schools, government, society no longer mirrors our Christian values as at one time our society did. Now you have to kind of deprogram your kid from all the stuff that he or she is picking up in school and online and so on and so forth. So it's a wise thing. You are skillful, those of you who have brought your children to this. You know, forget the papier-mâché and the jumping up and down and the crazy songs and stuff like that. They're kids, right? They're kids. I mean, you're mature. You can sit here and we can have this dialogue. Kids, I wouldn't keep them for 5 minutes. But make no mistake how serious the intent is, okay? So that they will live skillfully. And anyways, the third theme, the philosophical theme, Proverbs identifies virtue with knowledge. In other words, the most important virtue to cultivate is the knowledge that enables a person to live skillfully before God and before man. This is why there's so many Proverbs that contrast wisdom and folly. I used to hate reading Proverbs because I was always on the side of the fool. The wise man does this, and then he says, and then the fool does this. And he could have been saying, and Mazzalongo does this. So every time I read Proverbs, like, it's getting a little better, I have to say, sometimes. It's also interesting to note that the virtue of wisdom is often personified as a woman in many verses. For example, wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. Proverbs 1:20. What is that? You see the parallelism there? Right? Synonymous parallelism. Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. Synonymous parallelism. Okay. All right. Outline of Proverbs. Simple, straightforward outline. Section 1, chapter 1, all the way to chapter 9. The excellence of wisdom, the merits and personification of wisdom. Section 2, the character of wisdom, chapter 10 to 22, compares righteous and wicked, wise and fool, rich, poor, proud, humble, thrifty, lazy. Most of them are 2-line verses using antithetic parallelism. In other words, the second line is in contrast to the first line. There are 375 Proverbs in this section. Section 3, the sayings of the wise, composed of 3 small collections of sayings. Section 4, chapter 25 to 29, a collection of Solomon's Proverbs. 2 types included, secular and religious. And these are the ones that have been edited and transcribed by the men of King Hezekiah, chapter 25, verse 1. And then finally, section 5, 30 and 31, the words of Agur and Lemuel. Agur and Lemuel are non-Jewish rulers whose works were added. And then you have the description of the worthy woman. That's what I read at my wedding. That's what I read to Lise, at our wedding. We each said things to each other. That's what I read, to her, and said, this is you. This is who you are. You're this person. And I can say after 36 years, she was that person and continues to be that person. What's interesting from a poetic perspective is that the worthy woman there in 30, that's an acrostic. That's an acrostic. All right? So the verse that we're going to be studying and examining is Proverbs chapter 19, verse 20. And that is in the second section of the book, dealing with the character of wisdom. And we will attack that verse after the break. So we're on